The day Isaiah Finley rode into Cold Creek, New Mexico territory, the sky was the particular shade of burnt copper that comes just before a summer storm breaks open and swallows the world whole, and Maggie Carter was standing on the porch of her general store with a broom in her hands, watching him come down the main road like a man carrying something invisible on his back that no one else could see. He was tall in the saddle, that much was plain from a distance. A dark bay mare moved beneath him with the careful, measured step of a horse ridden by someone who did not believe in wasting energy on anything unnecessary. The man himself sat straight, not with the prideful stiffness of someone trying to impress, but with the quiet economy of a person who had learned that the world did not hand out comfort, and so had stopped expecting it. His hat was pulled low against the approaching dark, and his coat was the color of deep tobacco, worn smooth at the elbows. He had a rifle in its scabbard and a bedroll tied neatly behind the saddle, and he carried nothing that was not useful. Maggie had lived in Cold Creek for 6 years, which was long enough to know what a man running from something looked like, and long enough to know that asking about it was the surest way to make him bolt. She swept her porch and let him pass. He did not stop at the saloon, which surprised her. Most men who came through the territory in that condition, bone-weary and wrapped in silence, made directly for the whiskey. Instead, he went to the livery at the far end of the road, and she watched him dismount with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body hurt in places he had grown accustomed to not showing, and she turned back to her sweeping and thought nothing more of it. That was a lie, of course. She thought quite a lot more of it. The year was 1882, and Cold Creek was the kind of town that existed in that particular in-between space of the American West, too large to be ignored by the railroad men who were slowly stitching the continent together with iron rails, too small to attract the serious attention of anyone who might make it prosperous. It had a bank, a school, 2 churches, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a blacksmith, the livery, and Maggie Carter's general store, which was called simply Carter's, and which served as the nearest thing the town had to a community center, a post office, and a lending library all at once, since Maggie had taken to stocking novels and newspapers from Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and charging a penny a day for borrowing privileges. She had started the store 3 years after her husband Thomas Carter had died of a fever that swept through the territory in the summer of 1876, leaving her with a building, a small amount of money he'd set aside, 2 horses, and a grief so complete it had felt for a while like a second skin. She had been 24 years old and entirely alone in a place where a woman alone was either pitied or preyed upon, and she had decided very early on that she would be neither. Now she was 30, and the store was profitable enough to keep her comfortable, and she had built a reputation in Cold Creek as someone fair-minded and sharp, who would extend credit to families struggling through dry seasons, and who would also calmly and firmly decline to stock certain brands of patent medicine she suspected were mostly alcohol and sawdust. People trusted her. That was the most valuable currency she had found in the territory, and she guarded it carefully. The morning after Isaiah Finley arrived, he came into the store. Maggie was behind the counter measuring out flour into brown paper sacks, and she heard the door open and looked up, and there he was, hat in his hands now, and she could see his face properly. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with dark eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that had seen things and learned to hold those things privately. His jaw was shaded with several days of beard growth. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that the dime novels she stocked described handsome. He was better than that, in the way that things shaped by use and weather are more interesting than things that have simply been ornamental. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Morning," she said. "What can I get for you?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a list written on a folded piece of paper which he placed carefully on the counter. She unfolded it and looked it over. Coffee beans, salt pork, hardtack, ammunition for a Winchester repeating rifle, a spool of heavy thread, a small glass bottle of turpentine and a block of lye soap. A man planning to be somewhere for a while, or at least planning to provide for himself rather than relying on the saloon and whatever passing hospitality the town might extend. She began pulling items from the shelves behind her. "You're new," she said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "Came in yesterday," he said. "I know, I saw you ride in." She set the coffee beans on the counter. "I'm Maggie Carter, this is my store." Isaiah Finley. He said his name the way a man says something that is simply true without decoration. "You plan to stay in Cold Creek long, Mr. Finley?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the distinct impression that the question required actual consideration rather than the automatic sort of polite answer most people gave. "I'm not certain yet," he said finally. She nodded as though that were the most natural response in the world because to her it was, and went back to gathering his supplies. She did not ask why he had come. She never asked why anyone had come. People arrived in the territory for all manner of reasons. Some were chasing something, land or fortune, or the particular kind of freedom that only exists when you put enough distance between yourself and whoever you used to be. Others were being pushed by things behind them. Both kinds were human, and both kinds needed flour and salt and lye soap, and that was Maggie's business. The other kind of business, the kind that involved speculating about the contents of a man's past, she had no interest in. He seemed to notice this somehow. He watched her work with a quality of attention that was different from the ordinary way men watched women in stores, which was usually a combination of impatience and mild condescension. He watched her with something closer to curiosity, and underneath that, something she might have called relief, though she would not have been prepared to explain exactly why. She tallied his goods and told him the price, and he paid in exact coin without negotiating, which told her something. A man careful with money but not desperate over it. He had some resources then, not wealthy but not broke. "Much obliged," he said, gathering his parcels. "Come back when you run low," she said. He put his hat back on and went out, and she watched the door close behind him and then stood very still for a moment with her hand resting on the counter, listening to the sound of the wind picking up outside, carrying the dry smell of sage and distant rain. She thought, that is a man who needs time, and she decided right then, without ceremony, that she would give him some. The first weeks of his presence in Cold Creek followed a pattern that Maggie observed from the natural vantage point of her store, which occupied the center of the main road, and from whose front window she could see most of what happened in town without appearing to be watching anything at all. Isaiah Finley rented a room at the boarding house run by the widow Pearson, a small, tidy woman in her 60s who took in respectable lodgers, and was famously unforgiving of tobacco smoke indoors or boots left on the parlor rug. The fact that he was still there after the first week told Maggie that he was, at minimum, a man of basic domestic consideration. He found work at the ranch outside town, belonging to a rancher named Dutch Elmore, who ran cattle on a spread that reached to the base of the San Andres Mountains. Dutch was a loud, sunburned man of 60 who had been in the territory since before most of the current inhabitants were born, and who had a talent for identifying useful men at a glance that he attributed to decades of experience, and that most people attributed to the fact that he was simply a good judge of character. He hired Isaiah Finley after 10 minutes of conversation, which was by Dutch's standard a lengthy and thorough interview process. Maggie knew this because Dutch came into the store the following Friday afternoon and bought tobacco, and told her about his new ranch hand, with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had found a good worker and wanted credit for the discovery. "Quiet fellow," Dutch said, packing his pipe. "Works harder than two ordinary men and doesn't waste time talking about it. Had horses before, I can tell you that. Knows cattle, too. Somebody taught that man to work, and whoever it was did a thorough job." "Where is he from?" Maggie asked, not because she was particularly interested in the answer, but because Dutch clearly wanted someone to ask. Dutch waved the question away. Didn't say and I didn't ask. Out here, a man's hands tell you more than his mouth does anyway. Maggie found herself agreeing with that more than she expected to. The second time Isaiah Finley came into her store was on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the first visit. He needed more coffee and a new pair of work gloves because, he explained, the pair he'd owned had split at the seam in the palm from the kind of work that splits gloves. He looked at the gloves she stocked with the careful attention of someone who understood the difference between gloves that would last and gloves that would not, and he chose a heavy pair in dark leather without any of the decorative stitching that some of the other pairs had. "How are you finding the territory?" she asked. "Hot," he said. She laughed before she could decide whether to. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, and it surprised her a little. He looked at her when she laughed, not startled but attentive, the way a man looks when something has his genuine interest. "That's an honest answer," she said. "Only kind worth giving," he said. She wrapped the gloves in brown paper and he paid and left, and she noticed that he had paused in the doorway for just a moment as though he might say something else, and then he didn't, and then he was gone, and the bell above the door rang softly in the silence he left behind. She stocked the shelves for a while after that, moving tins of beans and canned peaches, and thinking about nothing in particular, which was her preferred method of thinking about the things that actually occupied her attention. It was in August that the situation with the Henderson family made itself known to the whole town. The Hendersons were homesteaders who had filed a claim on land about 12 miles northeast of Cold Creek, Elbert and Ruth Henderson and their 3 children, and they had come to the territory 2 years earlier from Missouri with the particular combination of optimism and practical stubbornness that characterized the best kind of settlers. They had built a solid house, gotten a well dug, and were working their claim with the methodical determination of people who intended to succeed. The problem was a man named Cord Rayburn, who operated a cattle concern south of town, and who had decided, with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to having his decisions go unchallenged, that the land the Hendersons had legally claimed was more useful to him as a water route for his cattle drives, and who had made this case to the Hendersons first by way of increasingly aggressive visits from his ranch hands, and then by the less subtle method of having their fence line torn down twice in 1 month. Elbert Henderson came into Maggie's store on a Tuesday morning with a bruise along his jaw that had not been there the previous week, and he bought flour and tobacco with the stiff dignity of a man who had not yet decided how much to say about his situation. Maggie set the tobacco on the counter and said, quietly, "Is your family all right, Mr. Henderson?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "We're managing. Has Cord Rayburn's outfit been on your land again?" He looked at her sharply, then relaxed slightly. "Word travels," he said. "This is a small town," she said. She kept her voice even and practical. "Have you been to see the county sheriff?" "Sheriff Hollis is not the most motivated man in the territory," Elbert said, which was a generous way of describing a situation that most people in Cold Creek described less charitably. Sheriff Dale Hollis was not corrupt precisely. He was simply a man who had learned that certain conflicts resolved themselves most conveniently when he was elsewhere, and who had developed a remarkable talent for being elsewhere at the relevant moment. "No," Maggie agreed. "He's not." She was still thinking about this when Isaiah Finley came in that afternoon for a tin of axle grease which the ranch needed, and she told him about the Hendersons without quite planning to, laying it out in plain terms while she looked for the grease on the back shelf. She was not asking him to do anything. She was simply saying it. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "The man's name is Rayburn," he said. "Cord Rayburn. He runs the double bar south of town. He's got money and connections to the Territorial Land Office, or at least he claims to, and he tends to use both whenever anyone pushes back. Legal claim," he said. "The Hendersons. Filed and recorded. I've seen the paperwork myself. Ruth Henderson showed it to me last spring when they were nervous about exactly this kind of trouble. Isaiah took the tin of axle grease and set his coins on the counter and was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "The nearest territorial judge is where?" "Mesilla, about 70 miles south." He nodded slowly. "A man could ride there," he said, "with the right documents." "A man could," she agreed. She did not say, "Will you?" She did not say, "I think you should." She said nothing further, and rang his cell, and he left. 2 days later, she heard from Ruth Henderson that a man had ridden out to their place to look at their claim documents and to ask careful, specific questions about dates and witnesses, and exactly what Reburn's men had said and done during their visits. Ruth had described him as quiet and thorough, and not given to false reassurances, and had seemed steadied by his presence in the way people are steadied by someone who takes their situation seriously without dramatizing it. Maggie heard this and felt something warm move through her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. The following Sunday, which was the one Sunday in 3 when the circuit preacher did not come through Cold Creek, a number of the town's residents gathered after their private worship in the open lot beside the store, as they sometimes did, to talk about town business in the informal way that served as the community's actual governing body, since the official town council was composed mostly of the same men who drank with Cord Reburn on Thursday evenings at the Red Lantern Saloon. Isaiah Finley was at this gathering, standing near the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands. Maggie noticed that he listened more than he spoke, and that when he did speak briefly to a question someone directed at him about the Henderson situation, he was precise and clear, and did not use more words than the answer required. She noticed also that he was watching her, not in the way that made a woman's skin prickle with discomfort, but in the way that a person watches someone they are trying to understand. She met his gaze once directly, and he didn't look away, which she respected, and neither did she, which he seemed to respect in return. And then someone asked her about the store's supply of winter goods, and she turned to answer, and the moment passed. After the gathering, when most people had drifted away, she was locking the store's front door when she became aware of him standing about 10 feet away, not approaching, just present, in the way of a man who is not sure if his company is wanted and is too honest to pretend otherwise. She turned and looked at him. "Thank you for what you did for the Hendersons," she said. "Haven't done much yet," he said. "Talked to some people, written a letter or two. That's more than anyone else has done." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. The evening light was going golden and long, the kind of light that made the whole territory look like something precious. "You didn't ask me to do it," he said. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't my place." Something shifted in his face at that, a small change barely visible, but she was a woman who had learned to read small changes. "Most people ask," he said. "When they tell you something like that, they're asking even when they're not saying it directly." "I suppose they are," she said. "But you're not most people, and I didn't assume you needed to be managed." He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had a quality to it that she recognized, the quality of someone encountering something unexpected and needing a moment to take its measure. "Can I walk you home, Miss Carter?" he said. "It's Mrs. Carter," she said. "I'm a widow, and yes, you may." He fell into step beside her, and they walked the 2 blocks to the small house behind the store where she lived, and they spoke about small things, the likelihood of rain before September, the quality of the winter coming based on how the horned toads were behaving, whether the Red Lantern's new piano player was better than the previous one, who had been entirely without musical gifts of any kind. He made her laugh twice. She made him smile once, which felt somehow like the greater accomplishment. At her gate he stopped and put his hat on and said good evening, and she said good evening, and she went inside and stood in her kitchen for a while with her hands pressed flat on the cool surface of the table, listening to the sounds of the evening settle into silence. She was 30 years old, and she had loved one man and lost him, and she had told herself, many times in many different moments of the years since, that the part of her that wanted to love someone again was a luxury she could manage without. She was not sure she still believed that. She was not sure she had believed it for some time, actually. She was just now admitting it. The Henderson matter came to a head in early September, and it involved Isaiah Finley in a way that became one of the stories the town told about him for a long time afterward. He had, in the weeks since his initial investigation, made contact through letters with the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Santa Fe, secured the interest of a land grant attorney who practiced out of Mesilla, and quietly assembled documentation from 3 witnesses who had seen Reburn's men tear down the Henderson fence on 2 separate occasions. None of this was dramatic. Most of it was paperwork and patience. But Cord Reburn was not a man who responded well to paperwork and patience, especially when it was paperwork that threatened his plans. And when he learned through his connections in town that a ranch hand at Dutch Elmore's place had been quietly building a legal case against him, he responded in the way that men like Reburn typically respond, which is to say, he sent 2 of his hands to deliver a message. The message was delivered on a Thursday evening on the road between Dutch Elmore's ranch and town, and it involved 2 men on horseback, a great deal of intimidating language, and one of them putting a hand on Isaiah's horse's bridle in a way clearly designed to demonstrate physical dominance of the situation. Maggie did not witness this herself. What she witnessed was Isaiah Finley walking into her store the following morning with a cut along his cheekbone that had been cleaned and closed with small, careful strips of cloth, and the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand meant he was managing something internally with deliberate effort. She did not gasp or flutter. She looked at the cut with a professional, evaluating eye, the way a woman who has lived in the territory for 6 years looks at wounds, which is practically, and she said, "Sit down. I have better supplies for that than whatever you used." He sat down on the stool she kept behind the counter, and she went to the back room and got her medical kit, which she kept well stocked because the territory had an unlimited supply of reasons for people to require bandaging, and she came back and stood before him and began cleaning the cut properly. He was very still while she worked. She could feel the controlled steadiness of him, the disciplined quiet of a man who has learned not to flinch, and she worked carefully and without hurry, and neither of them spoke for a while. "Did they say anything specific?" she asked finally. "Told me I should find other employment," he said. "Said the territory had a short patience for men who stuck their noses in other people's business." "What did you say?" "Not much. Said the Hendersons' business was their own, and I was simply helping them make that point to the relevant authorities. And then they decided to make a different kind of point," he said, and there was the faintest dry edge to it that was not quite humor but was in the same neighborhood, and she appreciated that. "Are you going to stop?" she asked. "What you're doing for them?" "No," he said, without any particular emphasis, just as a fact. She pressed a clean cloth against the cut and held it. "Good," she said. He looked at her then, directly, close as they were in the small space behind the counter, and she looked back, and there was something between them that was not just the proximity of a woman tending a wound and a man enduring it. There was a quality of recognition to it, the recognition of 2 people who are, in some fundamental way, made of similar material. "You're not worried," he said. Not an accusation, more like something he was working out. "I'm practical," she said. "Cord Reburn is a bully. Bullies have a limited range of tactics. You're handling it correctly, through legal means, and that limits what he can do without making himself look very bad to the people in Santa Fe whose opinion actually matters to him." "That's a clear-eyed assessment," he said. "I've been in this territory a while," she said. "I've seen several versions of Cord Reburn." She finished with the bandaging and stepped back, and the distance between them returned to its proper social measurement, and she thought she saw something that might have been regret cross his face before it settled back into its usual composed expression. "The lawyer from Mesilla, has he responded to your last letter?" "Letter came yesterday," he said. "He's willing to come up for a hearing if we can get Sheriff Hollies to stop pretending he can't read his own name on an official complaint form." "I can help with that," Maggie said. He raised an eyebrow. "Dale Hollies has been running a tab at this store for 4 years," she said. He hasn't pushed it past reasonable, but he knows I know the difference. I'll have a conversation with him." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a tone that had something careful and genuine underneath it, "Mrs. Carter, are you sure I'm the one helping the Hendersons? It seems like it might be both of us." She smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that didn't perform itself. "We're just neighbors looking after neighbors," she said. "That's how it's supposed to work." He stayed a little longer than was strictly necessary to complete the business of getting his cheekbone tended, but neither of them acknowledged this. He looked at her shelves, and she found things to straighten that didn't need straightening, and they talked about Dutch Elmore's cattle, and the coming harvest, and the new schoolteacher who had arrived from Ohio the previous month, and was apparently doing an excellent job of teaching the children of Cold Creek that the world was larger than the territory, and also that mathematics was non-negotiable. When he left, she stood at the window and watched him cross the main road, and she thought, "I am in considerable trouble here." She said it out loud, to the empty store, and the empty store said nothing back, and she went to have a conversation with Sheriff Dale Hollies about his account. The conversation with Hollies went as she had expected, which is to say it was uncomfortable for him and businesslike for her, and it produced the result she had anticipated. A formal complaint was accepted and logged, and the attorney from Mesilla confirmed his availability for October. The weeks between September and the hearing were the weeks that Maggie Carter would remember most clearly for the rest of her life, not because of anything dramatic that happened in them, but because of the texture of ordinary time spent increasingly in the company of a person who was becoming essential. Isaiah came into the store 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes with a specific need, and sometimes she slowly allowed herself to understand without one. He would come in and buy something small, a newspaper, a tin of tobacco he seemed to use sparingly, a small book from her lending shelf, and they would talk. The conversations ranged across a remarkable amount of territory for two people who were ostensibly conducting transactions. They talked about the railroad and what it would mean when it finally came through, and whether that was something to welcome or mourn. They talked about the schoolteacher from Ohio and the quality of education available to children in the territory compared to children in places that had been established longer. They talked about the land itself, the strange, harsh beauty of it, the way the light changed in the late afternoon over the San Andres and made everything look like it was made of amber and copper. She told him about Thomas, eventually. Not all of it, not the grief part, which she kept private, but the facts of him. That he had been a good man, a steady man, that he had come to the territory from Kentucky with plans for a trading concern, and that the fever had taken him before those plans had properly gotten started, and that she had taken what he had built and made it something on her own. Isaiah listened in the way that he listened to everything completely, without the restless impatience that some men had, the half-listening that was really just waiting for their turn to speak. He listened as though what she was saying mattered. He did not, in return, tell her why he had come to the territory. She did not ask. This was the thing she would try to explain later, when she was much older and people asked her to describe the beginning of it, the peculiar, deliberate grace of not asking. It was not incuriosity. She was intensely curious about Isaiah Finley in the way that you are intensely curious about something that has become, somehow, the most interesting thing in your world. It was rather that she understood, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than reasoning, that the question would arrive in its own time, or it would not, and that his willingness to speak of it was his to give when he was ready, and that her asking before he was ready would be a kind of trespass, and she had no wish to trespass on him. She knew the shape of a man carrying something he was not ready to put down. She had seen it in the mirror for the 2 years after Thomas died. You did not pry at those things. You simply stayed close enough that the person knew the option existed. He knew she wasn't asking. She could tell. There were moments, small, glancing moments, when he would look at her with an expression she could only describe as relief, the way a person looks when they have been braced for a thing that does not come. And she thought that whatever he was carrying, whatever had brought him to the territory and kept him from talking about it, he had likely been asked about it by a great many people before her in a great many ways. She thought that the silence she offered him was perhaps the most useful thing she had in her considerable inventory. October came, and with it the hearing regarding the Henderson land claim. The attorney from Mesilla, a compact, efficient man named Graves, arrived 3 days before the hearing and set up his materials at the boarding house and spent 2 days reviewing everything Isaiah had assembled and expanding it with his own expertise in territorial land law. The hearing itself was held at the county courthouse in the larger town of Esperanza, 15 miles east of Cold Creek, and a number of people from Cold Creek made the journey to attend, partly out of support for the Hendersons and partly out of the territorial tradition of not missing anything interesting. Maggie closed the store for the day and went. She sat in the courthouse gallery with Ruth Henderson beside her and watched Isaiah Finley testify in the measured, specific way he had of presenting facts. And she watched Cord Reburn's attorney try and fail to rattle him. And she watched the federal land commissioner's representative, a thin man who had come down from Santa Fe specifically for this, because the letter Isaiah had written had apparently been the kind of letter that federal representatives found difficult to ignore. Take careful notes throughout. The ruling came 2 weeks later, by telegraph, and then by letter. The Henderson land claim was upheld. Reburn's men were formally barred from the property, and a note was made in the land commissioner's records that would make any future interference considerably more consequential for Reburn legally. Cord Reburn was not a broken man by this. He had too much money and too much land for one failed land grab to break him, but he had been checked, clearly and publicly, and that mattered in the territory in ways that went beyond the specific legal outcome. Dutch Elmore hosted a supper at his ranch to celebrate, and most of Cold Creek attended, and it was a genuinely joyful evening with fiddle music and a great deal of food, and the particular collective warmth that comes when a community has seen something fair happen in an unfair landscape. The Hendersons' eldest boy, who was 11 and serious, sought out Isaiah specifically to shake his hand, which he did with both hands and a gravity that made several people nearby quietly emotional. Maggie watched this from across the room and felt something so clear and unambiguous in her chest that she almost laughed at herself for having spent weeks pretending it was something she needed to think more carefully about. She was in love with Isaiah Finley, or she was becoming so at a rate that made the distinction academic, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it, which was an unusual experience for a woman who generally knew what to do about most things. She found out what to do about it in the end, by doing nothing and letting it find her. The night of Dutch's supper, later in the evening when the music had gone slower, and the younger children had fallen asleep on their mothers' laps, and the conversations had gotten quieter and more personal, Isaiah appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of coffee and offered her one, and she took it, and they stood together at the edge of the barn's wide-open doors looking out at the night sky, which was doing the thing the New Mexico Territory sky did in October, which was to be so full of stars that it seemed impossible and slightly personal. "Good night," he said, meaning the evening, the outcome, all of it. "Yes," she said, "a very good night." They were quiet together for a while, and it was the kind of quiet that is its own form of conversation. Then he said, not looking at her but at the stars, "I came here from Missouri." She did not say anything. She was very still. "From a town called Garrison," he said. "Grew up there, had a place there. A piece of land my father left me." He paused. The fiddle inside had shifted to something old and gentle. "I had a partner in a horse breeding operation, a man I'd known since we were boys. His name was Caleb Worth." She held the coffee cup in both hands and waited. "Caleb's wife was named Clara. She and Caleb had a difficult marriage. Difficult is the charitable word for it." His voice was still even, but she could hear the careful work of keeping it so. There were things that happened in that marriage that I knew about and did not speak of to the right people quickly enough, because I thought a man's marriage was private, and because Caleb was my partner and I told myself it was not my place. He stopped. Clara died in the spring of 1880. The official finding was an accident. The coroner was a man who owed Caleb money, which may or may not have been relevant. Maggie did not move. The stars were extraordinary. There were people in Garrison who knew what I suspected about Caleb. Some of them thought I should have acted sooner. They weren't wrong. He was quiet for a moment, and Caleb himself knew what I suspected. The situation in Garrison became untenable for multiple reasons. "So you left," she said quietly. "So I left," he said. He turned then and looked at her, and in the warm light spilling from the barn she could see the weight of it on him, the specific weight of a thing that has been carried alone for a long time. "I'm not a man who ran from justice, Mrs. Carter. I want to be clear about that. The law in Garrison made its conclusion, and I disagreed with it and was in no position to change it. But I could not stay in a place where that conclusion had been made and continue doing business with a man I believed responsible for Clara Worth's death." "I understand," she said. "I have not spoken of this to anyone since I arrived here," he said. "Not because I was hiding it, but because it wasn't time," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes. And now?" He took a moment before he answered, and the moment was not evasion, just the honest measurement of something. "I believe I am," he began and then stopped and tried again. "There is a person in this town who has made me feel that this territory is a place I might put down roots rather than simply pass through, and I thought that person deserved to know the weight of what they'd be dealing with in the event that they had any interest in dealing with it." She looked at him for a long moment. The fiddle played something sweet and far away inside the barn. The stars were preposterous. "Isaiah," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both registered it. "I knew the moment you came through that door that you were carrying something. I knew because I recognize it. I carried something for 2 years after Thomas died. What you're carrying is real and it's heavy, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She paused. "But I'm not afraid of it, and I'm not going to ask you to be lighter than you are." He was very still. "The question I actually have," she continued, "is whether you have any intention of doing anything about this person in town you mentioned. Because I am 30 years old and I have run a business by myself for 6 years, and I am many things, but a patient woman has always been among them, and yet I will say to you plainly that there is a limit." He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something she had not yet seen him do fully, without reservation. He smiled. It transformed his face. It went all the way to his eyes, and it was warm and real and a little rueful, and it made her heart do something entirely uncooperative. "Could I call on you Sunday?" he said. "You can," she said. He came on Sunday, with his hat in his hands and a bunch of late-season wildflowers that he had clearly stopped to gather somewhere along the road, purple and gold and slightly wind-battered in a way that was more charming than polished flowers from a vase would have been. She made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, and when he left in the late afternoon, he paused at the gate and turned back and said, "Thank you, Maggie," and she said, "Come back next Sunday," and he said he would. He did. The courtship that followed was conducted with the particular honesty of two people who were past the age of pretending to feel things they did not feel or hiding things they did. He came on Sundays. He came into the store through the week. He took her riding on a Saturday in November when the air had that crystalline coldness that turned the whole territory stark and beautiful. They rode out east of town to where the land opened up into something that felt genuinely ancient, and they dismounted at the rim of a shallow canyon and sat on the rocks and ate the food she had packed in her saddlebag and talked. And he took her hand in both of his and held it for a long time, and they watched the light go down over the canyon, and it was one of the most purely beautiful things she had ever experienced. He was deliberate about his feelings in the way that some people are deliberate about everything, not cold, not withholding, but careful, as though he understood that the expression of genuine feeling was a serious matter that deserved to be done properly. He told her he cared for her, and the way he said it, as though the words had been considered and confirmed before being spoken, made them feel weightier than the same words said lightly would have. She told him she cared for him too, sitting on a rock at the edge of a canyon in November in the New Mexico territory, with her hand in both of his and the last of the sunlight going gold above them, and she was not afraid to say it. Winter came to Cold Creek with more severity than the previous 2 winters, and the town pulled inward in the way that winter makes communities pull inward, toward the warmth of community, toward the particular closeness of people who have decided they are going to endure a thing together. Isaiah had taken on additional responsibilities at Dutch Elmore's ranch, as Dutch's own health began to show the wear of 6 decades of hard outdoor work, and he proved himself as capable a ranch manager as he had been a ranch hand, which was saying something. Dutch regarded him with the particular approval of an old man watching someone younger do a job well, and mentioned to Maggie on several occasions that Finley was one of the best investments he'd made in some time. Maggie expanded the store's inventory in anticipation of the harder winter months, adding more preserved goods and a small selection of medicines, and an increase in the lending library's holdings, which she had come to think of as a public service that the territory genuinely needed. She also wrote a careful letter to the Santa Fe newspaper about the cord reburn situation, framing it as a discussion of land rights and the specific vulnerabilities of small homesteaders, and the letter was published and was noted by the territorial governor's office, which was a small thing but was not nothing. Isaiah read the published letter in the copy of the Santa Fe paper she received, standing in her store with his coat still on because he had just come in from the cold, and when he put the paper down he looked at her with an expression that combined admiration and something else, something warmer. "You wrote this," he said. "I did," she said. "It's excellent," he said. Specific and damning without being inflammatory. He paused. "You are a remarkable woman, Maggie Carter." She was used to compliments by now, his particular kind, which were always specific and which arrived without preamble or artifice. They still affected her with a consistency that she found slightly embarrassing and entirely agreeable. "Thank you," she said. "You can pay for your coffee now." He laughed. His laugh, when it came fully, was low and genuine, and she had come to love the sound of it. Christmas in Cold Creek was a modest affair, as it had always been. The community gathered at the church that the Baptist preacher used on his rotation through the territory, and there was singing and a small exchange of gifts, and the store produced a great deal of its preserved candy stock and a quantity of ginger cakes that Maggie had been preparing for a week. Isaiah attended the church gathering and stood beside her in the pew, and when the singing began he sang too, in a quiet, accurate baritone that she had not known was there, and she was charmed by the discovery of it in the way you are charmed by every new piece of a person who has become important to you. After the church gathering he walked her home, as he had done many times by now, and at her gate he stopped and she turned to face him, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing their extraordinary thing again. He said, "I've been thinking." "About," she said. "About the nature of this territory," he said. "About the fact that a man without a particular reason to stay somewhere eventually drifts, unless he gives himself a reason that is fixed enough to hold." She waited. "I've been thinking about what kind of reason might be fixed enough," he said, "for a man like me in a place like this." "And," she said, "and I find I keep arriving at the same answer," he said, "which is that the reason would need to be a person, not a piece of land or a prospect or a plan, because I've had those and they are not sufficient. A person." The cold was sharp and clean around them. Somewhere down the road a horse shifted in its stable. "Isaiah," she said, in the voice she used when she was telling someone something both gentle and entirely serious, "if you are asking me something, you should ask it." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me, Maggie?" She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had ridden into her town in a copper sky, who had stayed when he might have left, who had carried something heavy and had not let it make him unkind, who had helped neighbors he did not need to help, who had walked beside her on all those ordinary days and made the ordinary days the best part of her week. "Yes," she said, "I will." He stepped forward and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with something in his face that was wholly unguarded, no composure or deliberateness, just an honest and open joy, and she felt it all the way through her. And then he leaned down and kissed her gently in the cold night air, and it was the right kind of first kiss, simple and warm and entirely sincere. They married in March of 1883, when the territory was beginning to shake off the winter, and the first pale green was appearing in the arroyos. On a bright Saturday morning, with the circuit preacher in attendance, and most of Cold Creek present, and Ruth Henderson providing a wedding cake of impressive ambition for a woman who had been baking in a homestead kitchen for 2 years. Dutch Elmore sat in the front row with the deliberate pride of a man who feels personally responsible for a good outcome, which was not entirely without justification. Maggie wore a dress she had ordered from Santa Fe, a deep blue-gray that Ruth said made her eyes look silver, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Isaiah had found somewhere with the same talent for finding wildflowers that he had demonstrated the previous autumn. He wore his good coat and a clean white shirt, and his face had the open, unguarded quality she had seen the night he asked her, and she walked down the aisle of the Baptist Church of Cold Creek, New Mexico Territory, with her hand on Dutch Elmore's arm because she had no father alive to give her away, and Dutch had asked with such hopeful dignity that she could not decline. And she arrived at Isaiah's side and they looked at each other, and the whole town seemed to exhale at once, a collective held breath released. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken in the direct, clear way that both of them did everything. And when it was done, the preacher pronounced them, and Isaiah kissed her in the sight of God and Cold Creek and the pale March sky, and the assembled company responded with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested they had been collectively invested in this outcome for some time. The first year of their marriage was, Maggie thought later, the kind of year that teaches you about a person in all the ways that courtship, however honest, cannot quite reach. You learn a person in the ordinary dailiness of shared life, in the way they handle small frustrations, and the way they move through a house in the early morning, and the way they are when they are tired or worried, in the thousand specific details of two people making a shared life from two previously separate ones. She learned that Isaiah woke early before light and was quiet about it, making coffee and sitting with it at the kitchen table in the dark before she came down, and that when she appeared, he would pour her a cup without being asked, and they would sit together in the early quiet and sometimes talk and sometimes not, and both were good. She learned that he was meticulous about certain things, the care of horses, the organization of tools, the sharpening of knives, and careless about others, like where he left his hat, which appeared in a remarkable variety of locations throughout the house that were not the peg by the door where it was supposed to live. She learned that he could be moved to laughter more easily than his public composure suggested, and that his laughter was one of the best things in her world. He learned, she supposed, equivalent things about her. He learned that she was formidable in the early morning in a way that she was careful to moderate in public, and that she had opinions about almost everything and held them firmly, but was genuinely willing to change them in the face of compelling evidence, which she considered a virtue, and he seemed to agree. He learned that she cried at certain kinds of music, the old sad kind, and that she was embarrassed about this, and there was no reason to be. He learned the precise geography of the store's operations and made himself useful to them in ways that did not undermine her authority over them, which required a certain intelligence that she appreciated. They had moved into her house, the one behind the store, and he had built on a room at the back that served as a combination of study and storage, and he had built it solidly and carefully, the way he did everything, and she had put a bookshelf in it, and he had added a second one for his own books, which included a battered copy of Thoreau and a surveying manual and a surprisingly well-thumbed volume of poetry that he did not explain and she did not ask about, but which she sometimes opened when he was out and found marked in places with small pencil lines beside certain lines. He had told Dutch Elmore in the spring after their marriage that he would be moving to work on his own behalf rather than Dutch's, which Dutch received with a mixture of disappointment and genuine generosity, offering to sell Isaiah a portion of the Elmore land at a fair price, which was the kind of offer that contained real trust. Isaiah had discussed this with Maggie over several evenings at the kitchen table, going over figures with the careful thoroughness he brought to serious decisions, and she had contributed her own analysis of their finances and her thoughts on the risk. And in the end, they had agreed to take a smaller portion of Dutch's land than originally offered, and to use some of their combined savings to build toward a small horse breeding and training operation, which played to Isaiah's deepest knowledge and which, they both calculated, had genuine viability in the territory. There was, that first year, also the matter of Missouri. It came up in the way that things that have not been fully resolved eventually come up, not suddenly, but gradually, through a series of small references that accumulated into a larger conversation. Isaiah received a letter from a man in Garrison named Hector Oakes in July, which he read and set on the table and sat looking at for a while before telling her what was in it. Hector Oakes had been a friend of Clara Worth. He wrote to say that Caleb Worth had left Garrison the previous winter under circumstances that were, as Hector put it, not voluntary in nature. There had been a renewed investigation into Clara's death, prompted in part by testimony from two people who had previously been reluctant to come forward, and the investigation had ended with Caleb Worth facing serious legal consequences. The letter was not triumphant. It was the letter of someone who understood that the outcome, correct as it was, came far too late and could not restore what had been lost. Isaiah read this letter and he was quiet for a long time, and Maggie did not fill the quiet with words. She sat with him at the kitchen table in the July heat and let the silence hold both of them. Eventually he said, "I should have gone to the law sooner. In Garrison, I know that." "Yes," she said simply. She did not cushion it or argue it away because he didn't need cushioning and because the truth of it was something he already knew and had already been living with. "I did not know what I knew," he said. "That's not an excuse, it's what happened. I suspected something and I told myself it was a marriage and not my business, and by the time I was certain, Clara Worth was dead and the law had already made its convenient finding. And after that," she said, "after that I could not make it right from inside Garrison, and I could not stay inside it, so I left and I came here." He looked at her. "I've asked myself many times whether leaving was cowardice." "Was it?" she said. He thought about this seriously. "I don't believe so. I believe I left because I had no useful function remaining there and my presence was causing harm to other people I cared about. But I'm aware that a version of that reasoning could be self-serving." "The fact that you're aware of it is relevant," she said. "Is it sufficient?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think what's sufficient is what you do from where you are," she said. "You can't go back and change what happened in Garrison. Caleb Worth is facing consequences now, which is what should happen. Clara Worth can't be brought back, which is the tragedy at the center of all of it, and that will be true regardless of what you do next. What you can do is be the kind of person who acts more quickly when he sees injustice, because he has paid the price of not acting." She met his eyes. "And from where I'm sitting, you already are that person. The Hendersons might have a different view of their land if you hadn't been willing to be that person." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and said nothing, and she understood that the silence was the fullest answer she could have received. He wrote back to Hector Oakes that week. She did not read the letter, but she saw him writing it at the desk in the back room, and it was several pages, and he wrote with great deliberateness, and at the end sat for a long time before folding it. After that he was quieter for a few weeks, in the way of a person who is laying something down, not perfectly, because these things are never perfect, but putting it into its right proportion, the proportion of something that will always be part of you, but that does not have to be the weight you carry in front of everything else. She gave him the time for that too. The horse operation came together through the fall of their first married year, slowly and then with increasing momentum, the way good things tend to develop in the territory, through patience and persistence rather than sudden fortune. Isaiah had an instinct for horses that was genuine and specific, and it attracted the attention of ranchers in the area who were always in need of well-trained animals. Dutch Elmore was his first paying client outside the family arrangement, followed by 2 other ranchers, and by the time winter came again, they had 5 horses in training and 3 prospective buyers for the following spring. Maggie ran the store, as she always had, and took increasing pleasure in the way that a profitable business reflects the trust of a community over time. She had expanded the lending library to 60 volumes and had begun charging a slightly higher price for the newer books, and using the proceeds to purchase more. And she had established a system of credit for families in need that was managed with the same care she applied to every financial aspect of the store. Several families in Cold Creek, through the dry seasons and the unpredictable years, had reason to be grateful for the Carters' credit system, and they tended to express this gratitude in the form of loyalty, which was the kind of gratitude that actually helped both parties. She also, in the spring of their second year of marriage, discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Isaiah on an evening in April when the territory was at its most beautiful, the brief window before the summer heat when everything was green and the air smelled like flowers and water. She told him quietly, at the kitchen table, with the evening light coming through the window, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions so genuine and unguarded that she felt, for a moment, the specific privilege of being the person who got to see him be entirely undefended. He said, how are you feeling?" "I'm well," she said, "tired in the mornings, otherwise well." He came around the table and she stood to meet him, and he held her, not in the urgent way of someone overwhelmed but in the steady, encompassing way of someone who wants to surround something precious with everything they have. "A baby," he said, against her hair. "A baby," she confirmed. He laughed then, and it was the fully open laugh she loved, and she laughed with him, and the kitchen felt warm and close and full. The pregnancy proceeded through the summer heat, with the combination of biological stubbornness and personal determination that characterized everything Maggie did. She continued to run the store through most of it, adapting as necessary, accepting help when offered without making a production of either the accepting or the refusing. Ruth Henderson came twice a week and helped with the heavier restocking, and Dutch Elmore's wife, a small wiry woman named Alma who had survived 35 years of the territory with formidable good humor, came regularly and provided both practical assistance and a running commentary on the nature of childbirth and infancy in the West that was simultaneously alarming and reassuring. Isaiah, through those months, was present in a way that was quiet and consistent and exactly right. He did not hover or fuss, because he understood that fussing would have been unwelcome. But he was there in the mornings with coffee before she asked for it, in the evenings with a hand on her back when she was tired, watching her with that quality of attention she had first noticed in the store when he was a stranger, now deepened by a year of marriage into something that felt like the most natural thing in the world. He talked to her in those months about Missouri. Not about Caleb Worth, but about the earlier parts, the farm his father had run, the particular quality of Missouri Spring, the horse he'd had as a boy that he'd named something embarrassing that he declined to specify. She collected these pieces of him with the care of someone who understands that a person reveals themselves in accumulated small stories rather than any single large one. She told him more about Thomas too, in those months, the good memories, the specific shape of her grief when it had been fresh, and how it had changed over the years into something that was part of her history rather than the whole of her present. "I don't want you to think I put him behind me," she said once, on an evening in July with a hot wind coming through the open window. "I loved him and I mourn him still, in the way that's right and natural, but love doesn't work like a bucket with a fixed amount in it. That's the thing that takes the longest to understand." "I know," he said. He was sitting across from her with his coffee in the particular relaxed posture he had in their house, the tension he sometimes carried in public entirely absent. "You loved him and you love me, and both of those are true at once." "Yes," she said. "Good," he said simply. "That's as it should be." They named their son James Thomas Finley, born in October of 1884, in the bedroom of the house behind the store, with Alma Elmore serving as midwife and Isaiah in the kitchen keeping himself useful by doing nothing useful at all while quietly losing his composure in a way that Alma reported to Maggie afterward with considerable pleasure and detail. James arrived in the early morning, after a labor that was long but resolved itself without serious complication, and Isaiah was allowed in when it was over, and he sat on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms, and looked at the child with the particular expression of someone encountering something that fundamentally reorganizes their understanding of the world. And Maggie, who was exhausted and triumphant and more purely happy than she had been in a very long time, watched him and felt the fullness of it. "He has your eyes," she said. Isaiah looked up from the baby and at her, and his face was wholly open, all the composure gone, just a man holding his son and looking at the woman he loved. "He has your stubbornness," he said. "Look at his jaw." She laughed, which she immediately regretted because laughing after childbirth is not comfortable, and he was concerned and apologetic, and she told him she was fine, and that she would send him out of the room if he became one of those men who treated a woman like she was made of blown glass after giving birth. And he said that he had no intention of doing any such thing. And James Thomas Finley opened his eyes and looked at his parents with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the very new. And the three of them were introduced to each other for the first time. Cold Creek grew in the years that followed, in the way that the territory grew, incrementally, sometimes painfully, pulled forward by economics and labor, and the slow processes of community formation. The railroad came through, not directly through Cold Creek itself, but close enough to matter, a spur line to Esperanza that meant goods moved faster and prices changed, and new people came, and some old ones left for new opportunities that the railroad opened up. The horse operation grew with the territory, because the territory's need for good horses did not decrease simply because a railroad existed. If anything, the increased traffic and commerce generated more need for reliable animals. Isaiah took on a partner in 1886, a young man named Luca Vega from a ranching family south of Cold Creek, who had a talent for the training side of the work, and who, as Isaiah observed, was exactly the kind of hard-working, straightforward person worth building something with. Together, they expanded the operation to a proper facility on the land they had purchased from Dutch Elmore. Dutch himself died in the spring of 1887, peacefully in his bed, after a winter illness that he had treated with characteristic stubbornness and refusal to be properly concerned about. His death was a genuine loss to the community, and Isaiah took it as the loss of a man who had been, in the territory, something close to a father figure in the limited, unsentimental way that men of that generation and place managed those relationships. He was quiet for several weeks after Dutch's funeral, not in the closed-off way of someone refusing grief, but in the working-through way of someone taking the time to feel what they were feeling. Alma Elmore, with the practicality that had always characterized her, got on fine. She had family in Albuquerque and visited them more frequently, and she and Maggie maintained a correspondence and occasional visits that both women valued highly. Carter's store continued to be what it had always been, the center of something in Cold Creek, and Maggie ran it with increasing assistance from James, who was a serious, capable child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's exact chin, and who showed an early interest in the business of the store that both pleased and amused his parents. By the time he was 7, he could make correct change and had opinions about the organization of the shelves that were, Maggie admitted privately to Isaiah, largely correct. A second pregnancy came in 1888, and this time the summer was kinder and Maggie had the confidence of knowing somewhat what to expect, and in the early days of 1889 they welcomed a daughter, which they named Clara Ruth Clara for Clara Worth, the woman whose tragedy had set Isaiah on the road that had brought him here, and Ruth for Ruth Henderson, who had become one of their closest friends. It was a naming that meant something specific, a way of holding things that should be held. Isaiah held Clara Ruth in the first minutes of her life and said her name quietly to himself, and Maggie knew what he was doing, holding both the grief of the past and the hope of the present in the same moment, giving them their proper weight, and she let him have that moment entirely. They were, by 1890, 8 years after Isaiah Finley had ridden into Cold Creek on a copper evening with something heavy and unspoken on his back, solidly rooted in a life that neither of them had anticipated and both of them had built, carefully and truly, from the materials they had in front of them. The store was thriving. The horse operation had a good reputation across 3 counties. James was 6 years old and could already sit a horse with the easy confidence of his father, and had recently developed a ferocious interest in the lending library's novels, which he read with his mother's focused intensity. Clara Ruth was a year old, and had the quality of disposition that Alma Elmore had described as ornery in the most complimentary possible sense, which matched the available evidence. They had good neighbors and difficult winters and long, beautiful summers, and the particular kind of arguing that people who love each other and are not afraid to have opinions engage in, which is productive and not frightening. They had the company of the Hendersons and the occasional visit from Alma and the annual arrival of the circuit preacher, and the accumulated social texture of people who have chosen to be somewhere and have stayed long enough to mean something to the place. On a November evening in 1890, 8 years almost exactly to the month from the night they had stood at Dutch Elmore's barn doors looking at the stars, and Isaiah had told her about Missouri, they sat on the porch of the house behind the store while the children were asleep inside, with coffee cups in their hands and a blanket across Maggie's lap against the chill, looking at the enormous sky. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. It was not a specific question because it did not need to be. "No," she said without needing to think about it. "Do you?" He was quiet for a moment, and she knew the quiet was not hesitation but genuine consideration, the way he always gave genuine consideration to things that deserved it. "No," he said, "not anything about here." A pause. "I regret Clara Worth. I will always regret that I did not move faster, no better. That is part of who I am and it doesn't leave." "I know," she said, "but I have understood something in the time I've been here," he said, "about regret, that you can carry it and not be crushed by it." At the weight of it can be, he searched for the word instructive rather than simply punishing, if you let it be. "And have you let it be?" "Mostly," he said. He looked at her sideways, and in the silver-cold porch light she could see the line of his face that was so familiar to her by now that the sight of it was like a form of breathing, automatic and essential. "You help with that considerably." "I didn't ask the right question," she said a little playfully. "No," he said. "You gave me the right silence." He reached over and took her hand from around the coffee cup and held it, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars above the New Mexico territory were doing what they always did, burning with that excessive, generous light. That was more useful than the questions would have been. "I'm glad," she said. "She never asked," he said, quiet and certain. "And I have loved her for that first and for everything after." She looked at him, at this man who had come to this territory for reasons he would not speak of, who had stayed for reasons that were now spoken between them every day in the ordinary language of a shared life. He was older than the man who had ridden in on the bay mare. They were both older than they had been. The way that time and love and difficulty and joy together make a person older in the good sense, in the sense of being more fully themselves. She leaned over and rested her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the cold November night in front of the sky that was always and perpetually extraordinary, and behind them the house was warm with the sleeping sounds of their children and the accumulated presence of everything they had made together. It was exactly what it was. It was more than enough. It was, in the particular arithmetic of real love, which does not calculate itself in terms of what was expected, but in terms of what was received and what was given, everything. James woke them on that morning of a spring in 1891 with the news that one of the mares in the horse operation had delivered overnight. A colt, dark bay like his father's horse had been, with the slightly dazed and confused expression of the very newly arrived, and they all went out together in the early morning light to look at him, Maggie and Isaiah and James and Clara Ruth on her father's hip, and the territory was doing what it did in the spring, going green along the arroyos and gold in the higher places, and the colt stood on his uncertain legs and blinked at the world with the pure unfamiliarity of something not yet acquainted with its own nature. James, who was 6 and serious and had his father's practicality applied to his mother's vocabulary, said the colt should be named something strong. Isaiah said that was a good principle for naming. Maggie said the colt should be named whatever he showed himself to be, that you couldn't name something before you knew it. Clara Ruth, who was 2 years old and had strong opinions about most things, said, with the authority of someone who has not yet been taught that 2 years old is an insufficient basis for certainty, a word that sounded approximately like good, and applied it to the colt with a pointed finger, and the colt looked at her with the same unfocused regard that all new things give to the world. Isaiah looked at Maggie over the children's heads, in the early morning light of the New Mexico territory, and what passed between them in that look was too large and too specific for words, so neither of them used any. He simply reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, and she smiled at him, and they stood in the spring morning on their own land with their children and their horses and the whole open sky above them, and it was complete, and it was good, and it was theirs. Years later, people in Cold Creek who had known them from the beginning would try to explain what was particular about Isaiah and Maggie Finley, what made them the kind of people that a town remembers not as a story but as a presence, as something that settled into the place and became part of what the place was. The explanations varied. Dutch Elmore's version, which had been told many times before his death, was simply that they were both people who took things seriously and took each other seriously, and that this was rarer than it ought to be. Ruth Henderson's version had more detail, about a woman who never asked more of a man than he was ready to give, and a man who understood what that cost her. The schoolteacher from Ohio, who was still there a decade later having married a local farmer and clearly never left, said she thought it was something about the quality of silence between them, that some people were loud together and some were quiet together, and the quiet kind were usually the ones that lasted. James Finley, who grew up to be a thoughtful man with his father's dark eyes and his mother's precision with language, and who eventually managed both the store and the horse operation while his parents grew old together in the house behind the store, had the clearest version. He said it was simple. He said his father had come to the territory for reasons he did not speak of, and his mother had never asked, and his father had loved her for that from the beginning and had kept on loving her for everything that came after, and his mother had loved his father in the same way that she did everything, entirely and without waste, with both her eyes open. The territory changed around them, as territories do. Statehood came in 1912, and with it, the slow transformation of the West into something more administered and less raw, something with paved roads advancing slowly from the cities and automobiles that the older generation regarded with a combination of fascination and deep suspicion. But those changes were still far off from the years when Isaiah and Maggie Finley were building what they built. And the world they inhabited was still the world that required a person to be genuinely tough and genuinely kind in equal measure. And they were both. They had more years than they had expected, which was the best kind of surprise. They grew old in Cold Creek, in the house behind the store, and the house grew around them. Another room added when James needed his own space. A proper parlor eventually. The kind that Maggie had always felt was a reasonable thing to aspire to, with a decent stove and a good rug and the shelf of books that had grown from 2 shelves to 4 over the years. Containing between them a library that was in itself a kind of autobiography of 2 people who read seriously and discussed what they read with even more seriousness. Isaiah's hair went gray at the temples first and then all the way through, and it suited him in the way that gray suits people who have always had that quality of depth. Maggie's went silver in her mid-50s, and she wore it plainly and without apology, and it made her look, Isaiah told her, exactly like what she was, a woman of complete substance. She told him he was flattering her. He said he was observing accurately, which he had always done. She said that was the thing about him, that he had always observed accurately, and had said what he observed honestly, and that this was the thing she had trusted from the very beginning. He said that she had given him the room to be honest, by not asking the questions that would have closed him off before he was ready, and that this had been the first gift, and everything had followed from it. On a morning in the autumn of a year well past the turn of the century, when the children were grown and had children of their own, and the house was often full of the particular loud, warm chaos of multiple generations occupying the same kitchen, Isaiah Finley sat on the porch of the house behind the store with a cup of coffee in his hands and the old familiar sky above the New Mexico territory and Maggie beside him in her chair. And the morning had that cool, clear quality of autumn mornings in the high desert, sharp as water. She had a book open in her lap, but she was not reading it. She was looking at the line of the mountains in the distance, the San Andres, which had been on the horizon since the first morning she had stood on her store's porch and watched a stranger ride in from somewhere and carry something unspeakable on his back with a dignity that had caught at her in a way she had not immediately understood. "Good morning," he said, though it was not a new morning, they had been awake for an hour already. "Good morning," she said. "What are you thinking about?" She smiled, not turning from the mountains. "The morning you rode in," she said, "the color of the sky." "That was a long time ago," he said. "Yes," she said, "and also it was yesterday." That's the strange thing about time. She looked at him then, her husband of all these years, the man who had arrived without explanation and stayed by choice and built something with her that neither of them could have built alone. "I'm thinking that I'm glad I didn't ask." He looked at her quietly, steadily, with those dark eyes that were the same eyes she had first seen across a store counter and that she had known across every morning since. "I'm glad you didn't either," he said. "I needed the time you gave me." "I know," she said. "You always knew," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat together on the porch in the autumn morning of a life entirely lived, looking at the old mountains and the impossible sky. And around them was the town they were part of, and the children who were theirs, and the long accumulated weight of years that had been, in the end and in the best and most honest accounting, very good years indeed. The colt that Clara Ruth had called good, that spring morning in 1891, had grown into a fine horse, and he had sired several more fine horses, and the Finley horse operation had made a modest but genuine mark on the territory. Carter's store was still Carter's store, though it was James who ran it now, and he ran it with the same fair-mindedness and the same lending library and the same credit for families in need that his mother had always maintained, because those were the principles of the place, and he understood them. The Henderson family was still 12 miles northeast, Elbert and Ruth gone now, but their children and grandchildren working the same land that Isaiah had helped them keep. The land had been theirs because he had been willing to act, and it was still theirs. And on that land things grew that would not have grown if he had been the kind of man who passed through without stopping. He had been the other kind, the kind that stops. She had been the kind that makes stopping worth it. Between them, out of the silence she had given and the truth he had eventually spoken and the ordinary, extraordinary days of a shared life, they had made something real and lasting in the territory that had received them, a permanence that was not in buildings or land records, though those existed too, but in the quality of presence that some people leave in the world, the sense that a certain goodness had been here, and had done its work, and had been genuinely, fully, and without reservation loved. The sky above Cold Creek, New Mexico territory, was exactly what it had always been: vast and unpitying and unreasonably beautiful. The same sky that had been burning copper the evening a tall man on a dark bay mare had ridden in from somewhere he would not name, and a woman on a porch with a broom in her hands had watched him come, and had decided, with the steady wisdom of a person who understands that the most important things in the world cannot be hurried or forced, to give him time. She had given him time. He had used it well, and the love that had grown from that patient, graceful silence had proved, in all the years since, to be the most durable thing either of them had ever built.